Hi, I'm Ross Hoke, leader of North Korea TMA. I'm here with my colleagues Marcus Awama, Ashley Villarreal, David Vasquez, and Ali Alvarez. We're here to present our presentation we've called Freeze Escalation, Thaw Relations, a diplomatic solution to the North Korean nuclear crisis. So North Korea's July 4th test of an ICBM has brought into public consciousness a reality that has long been clear, though we've often avoided acknowledging it. North Korea is here as a nuclear power. It will likely be able to hit the mainland United States within the year, and the regime sees nuclear weapons as vital to its security and the final and most important rung on their escalatory ladder, which they deem necessary to deterring foreign encroachment. In response to the Obama administration's policy of strategic patience, comprised of diplomatic and economic isolation, shows of military force in South Korea and the Yellow Sea, and UN-backed sanctions, North Korea has only expedited their nuclear weapons programs. And Defense Secretary Mattis has said that the North Korean nuclear program is our most urgent threat to our national security. In light of such past failures and recent developments, it is clear that we need a new policy for dealing with North Korea, and soon. At this point, there are broadly three courses of action open to us. The first is to pursue a hardline military policy of brinkmanship, involving drastically increased military operations in the region in order to make the regime fear for its existence, for as long as it continues with its nuclear program. This could involve limited strikes against North Korean military installations, but in response, North Korea would very likely escalate, likely bringing us into a full-scale Second Korean War, in which Seoul would take as much as 1 million casualties within days. Yet any military aggression short of a strike against North Korea would still carry significant risks of escalation, while offering little hope of yielding a resolution. As the North Koreans so firmly associate their nuclear weapons program with their security, that any aggression would only serve to convince them that having a nuclear arsenal was even more vital. At the other end of the spectrum, the second option is simply living with a nuclear North Korea equipped with ICBMs, as we have lived with other new nuclear powers in the past, counting on policies of extended deterrence and containment to maintain stability. Basically, this is a revision of strategic patience that addresses North Korea's newly developed ICBMs and realizes that no matter how patient we are, the North Korean nuclear issue is very likely here to stay. While we should prepare ourselves for such an outcome, a nuclear North Korea does prevent a graver security risk than past instances of proliferation because of North Korea's geopolitical positioning, diplomatic isolation, and the extremes to which the regime is willing to go to maintain power. Such passivity would also weaken the credibility of our commitment to non-proliferation. Thus, it would be a mistake to take such a passive route if we had an alternative option, giving us significant chances to deal with the North Korean nuclear threat while limiting risk to acceptable levels. Our proposal, negotiations from strength, is such an option. First, we would negotiate with China to get them to impose targeted economic pressure on the North Korean regime in order to bring North Korea to the table for bilateral and multilateral talks. Given the importance of Chinese leverage and China's history of resistance to imposing such pressure, we'd be willing to offer major concessions to China in the event that North Korea agreed to our terms on a nuclear freeze. Possible concessions could include removing THAAD from South Korea or a reduction of freedom of navigation patrols in the South China Sea. We believe that with American and Chinese economic leverage, as well as offers of aid and a reduction of military exercises in South Korea, we would have good chances of negotiating a nuclear freeze, thus mitigating the North Korean nuclear threat and providing a pathway towards denuclearization in the future. We recognize that negotiations on the North Korean nuclear program have had a history of, at best, mixed results. While we believe that we can build upon the temporary nuclear freeze that was a part of the agreed framework of the Clinton negotiations and the multilateral nature of the six-party talks, several factors would give this round of negotiations far greater chances of success than prior ones. For one, we have a window of opportunity with two new leaders, President Trump and President Moon of South Korea, open to direct negotiations, unlike their predecessors. Secondly, the uncertainty surrounding President Trump's policy on North Korea and China gives them the freedom for a flexible and innovative approach, one like ours in which we would use new tools to bring about an agreement, including a new mode of negotiations involving simultaneous bilateral and multilateral talks, and negotiations to bring about far greater cooperation from China on North Korea than we've ever had before. Lastly, and most importantly, for the first time, our goal would not be total nuclear disarmament, but a nuclear freeze, a much more realistic goal given North Korea's security concerns. And now I'll hand it over to our nuclear expert, Marcus Iwama, to talk to us about North Korea's nuclear capabilities and our nuclear freeze proposal.
Hello, I'm Marcus Iwama, the nuclear expert, and today I will be discussing the specific nature of our proposed nuclear deal. North Korea, as of now, has completed 5 successful nuclear tests, 1 in 2006, 1 in 2009, 1 in 2013, and 2 in 2016. We are currently unsure if they have been able to make progress in uranium enrichment. However, as a country, they do have ample natural reserves of uranium ore. Additionally, the main facility of their nuclear program is believed to be located in mountains in Yongbyon, which is north of Pyongyang. Their ability or inability to attach a miniaturized nuclear warhead to an intermediate-range ballistic missile is also currently unknown. These hidden and dangerous nuclear variables, in conjunction with the recent breakdown of our diplomatic relations, could lead one to believe that the North Korean regime is taking up a volatile mission to conquer the world and inflict terror. But this is not the case. Above all, the regime seeks survival and respect, and in their eyes, nuclear weapons are the means to these ends. Kim Jong-un may be a dictator responsible for countless human rights violations, but he is not a madman welcoming nuclear war and the destruction of his dynasty. This would directly contradict the deterrent nature of his nuclear program in the first place. Now, of course, a denuclearized North Korea would be the ideal scenario. Yet, as Ross previously explained, military intimidation efforts are not going to lead to a North Korean disarmament. They will never completely forfeit their means of survival, lest we destroy them ourselves and incite a nuclear war. Our best option is to pressure for a nuclear freeze until a future can be established wherein North Korea can feel secure via other means and denuclearization can eventually become a feasible reality. This freeze would carry many of the same benefits as denuclearization, in addition to actually being a feasible diplomatic goal. We would stop the proliferation of further nuclear production while also establishing a much safer context if the regime were to, for whatever reason, collapse. Only a very nuclear threat would be present after such chaos, rather than a full-scale nuclear arsenal. The deal for this freeze would likely pan out in the following way. We would negotiate for a freeze on all nuclear activities. This would include a halt of uranium/plutonium enrichment, missile tests, as well as importation/exportation of materials used for further nuclearization. This would be, once again, uranium, plutonium, centrifuges used for production, as well as technical data, blueprints. Then the deactivation of the Yongbyon nuclear facility/other facilities for purposes other than storage or preservation of already produced radioactive material. The second thing would be compliance to IAEA inspections and regulations. So proper storage of radioactive materials, safeguard visits and routine inspections, and ad hoc inspections with honest declarations of nuclear materials as well as radioactive assets. Now, what we would be willing to concede is, number one, a removal of American and Chinese sanctions related to the nuclear program, which David will explain in depth later on, an end of U.S. military exercises in South Korea, which Ashley will explain later on, as well as acknowledgement of North Korea as a nuclear power by allowing re-entry into the IAEA without forfeiting previously constructed illicit nuclear weapons and materials. This way, we are acknowledging their perceived need for nuclear weaponry via an international institution, while also holding them accountable to the oversight and regulatory processes of said institution. Number four, 500,000 tons of nutritious food over the course of 2 years. This is something that we have offered and North Korea has asked for in the past, and it would also be a good symbol of humanitarian intent on our part. And then number 5, a shift in rhetoric from the American president and from American officials. And so to expand on that very important point, we must be able to think vicariously with regards to the current position of North Korea and portray such an understanding to the public eye. It is vital that we don't employ escalatory public statements that could hinder the relations we are attempting to normalize in the first place. In addition, we must not convey that America has abandoned nonproliferation, but rather that it is imperative to see the reality of the situation. North Korea is a nuclear power. Recognition of this fact will lead to inspections and the transparency of their otherwise opaque nuclear program. They may be allowed to keep their current warheads and materials as deterrents, but they won't be permitted to produce any more. This policy sticks to nonproliferation while also recognizing the very real danger of a nuclear-armed country perceiving its means of survival as threatened. Such an understanding is just one way in which this diplomatic effort strays from past negotiations. We have always demanded complete denuclearization without addressing the real concerns that nuclear weaponry mitigate, those of security and sovereignty. However, if they should fail to honor the deal, we will levy a similar threat to the one that exists in the Iran nuclear deal. A snapback where US and Chinese sanctions are reapplied. The nature of these snapbacks will be explained in depth later on by David. North Korea is once again placed on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. The regime is publicly shamed as being too irresponsible to handle the ownership of nuclear weapons, and US military exercises in South Korea will resume as before. This snapback will have a minimum longevity of 10 years, no questions asked. The nuclear freeze could be the means to eventual denuclearization without demanding or needing it. We have to continue to promote diplomatic tranquility until the time arrives when relations normalize to a point where North Korea will perceive their extremely limited nuclear arsenal as more of a liability than a necessary tool for survival. One way to see that this future could eventually occur is to guarantee the success of the Iran nuclear deal, which could very well convince Kim Jong-un and the North Korean regime that denuclearization and survival as a state are not mutually exclusive. Thank you for your time, and now I pass the stage to our military expert, Ashley.
Hello and good morning. My name is Ashley Villarreal, and I am North Korea Team A's military expert. Our team's perspective on our military options is that executing preventive strikes on North Korea would escalate to catastrophic conflict in the East and potentially domestically. Therefore, before we enter negotiations with the goal of a nuclear freeze, we should continue to pursue a policy of deterrence, strengthen our missile defenses, and employ methods of cyber sabotage to interfere and damage North Korea's nuclear program in a covert fashion. Our primary objective is to avoid any military escalation. There are currently 3 preventive military options open to us. The first would be for us to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles from a ship or sub. The second would be to conduct airstrikes. In order for this to happen, we would most likely need to eliminate North Korean air defenses. The third and most high-tech option would be the employment of new technologies, such as a bunker-busting bomb or the employment of electromagnetic railguns. All 3 of these choices would be dangerous, seeing as they could lead to immediate escalation. There is an immense possibility that the North Koreans would perceive these preventive measures as full-scale attacks, or even as an assault against the oppressive regime itself. In this case, the North Koreans would definitely retaliate, a risk that we should not be willing to take for costly measures that would not even fully eliminate the country's nuclear program. Seeing as their arsenal is carefully hidden underground and within the mountains, at best these attacks would take out 90% of North Korea's firepower, and the remaining 10% would still be incredibly threatening to South Korea and Japan. This would be in addition to their vast conventional artillery capabilities, which place Seoul well within their range. This includes 8,000 artillery cannons and rocket launchers on the DMZ, which can fire approximately 300,000 rounds at South Korea within the first hour of an attack alone. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis has warned that it, quote, would probably be the worst kind of fighting in most people's lifetimes, unquote. Instead, we propose that we maintain our military defenses in the region, along with the continuation of large-scale joint military exercises with South Korea while we wait to engage in negotiations. On Tuesday, July 11th, the United States tested the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, THAAD's capabilities, and confirmed that the missile defense system successfully intercepted the intermediate-range ballistic missile it was targeting, as it has its last 14 targets. However, THAAD has some limitations. It can only intercept missiles in their descent, and as a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation points out, in order to defend all of South Korea, we would need 3 or 4 of the batteries it uses. Along with these technological flaws, the system is of course also vulnerable to North Korean attacks. Although it is not as advanced as we would like it to be, THAAD can serve as a helpful asset. In the period of time before negotiations, we would like to continue to use the THAAD system as well as build upon Aegis, our own missile defense system back home, in order for it to eventually be able to prevent the attack of an intercontinental ballistic missile. During negotiations with China, which my colleagues will expand on, we will offer the removal of THAAD in exchange for concerted economic pressure on North Korea. Although this may seem a bold decision, we are more than aptly prepared to deter North Korea through the use of conventional methods and the threat of our own overwhelming nuclear capabilities in the event of a North Korean nuclear attack. In South Korea, we have 28,500 troops, and in Japan, we have 54,000 military personnel and 8,000 Department of Defense civilian employees. We have also deployed 3 carrier strike groups, amphibious assault ships, and the bulk of the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force. In short, THAAD will be a useful tool leading up to negotiations, but it is definitely not vital. We would also like to point out that this strategy would not entail deploying additional military assets to the Pacific, as this could provoke China to also further militarize in the region and gain control over it. An outcome we do not want, as it could lead to more tension and the possibility of direct conflict between us and them. Another more efficient and less costly option on the table is that of cyber attacks. In early 2017, an intermediate-range ballistic missile that North Korea was attempting to test exploded shortly after its launch. According to experts, this result was caused by a left-of-launch attack executed by the United States government through the use of electromagnetic propagation, also known as cyber attacks. And, quote, infected electronics aboard the weapon that confuse its command and control or targeting systems, unquote. We would be looking to further invest into the realm of technological warfare and continue executing these attacks, which lessen costs and offer a shield of covertness. Investment in these technological advances could be beneficial before and after negotiations and would be influential in shaping the modern definition of war. Now I'd like to pass it off to my teammate David to discuss our economic strategy.
Hello, I'm David Vascones, and I'll be speaking about the economic aspects of our team's proposal. As my teammate Ashley said, escalation of our military efforts will not succeed in stopping North Korea's nuclear program. We believe that the best way to leverage an agreement for a nuclear freeze is to increase our campaign of targeted secondary sanctions on entities that give the North Korean regime essential support. And we believe that such leverage requires the cooperation of China. China provides the crucial economic lifeline to the Kim regime. Bilateral trade between the two countries has increased dramatically in recent years, from less than $500 million in the year 2000 to its peak at $6.86 billion in 2014, and remaining close to $6 billion in the years since. China provides upwards of 90% of North Korea's total trade volume. Trade between the two countries in the first quarter of this year was up more than 37% from last year. What these figures clearly represent is a nation largely isolated in terms of its economy, heavily and increasingly dependent on Chinese capital, trade, and aid. A major source of income for the regime are the North Korean financial reserves kept in Chinese banks, which allow North Korea to avoid sanctions by laundering its resources through these banks. Another source is the sale of North Korean coal to China, accounting for about a third of official exports in 2015, sales which continue off the books despite Beijing's restriction on North Korean coal imports. The Kim regime also profits from the illegal sale of counterfeit currency, the production and trafficking of drugs, the arms trade, and North Korean laborers sent overseas in these staggering numbers to work under horrible conditions, while the regime takes up to 90% of their earnings. These illicit activities, mainly managed by North Korea's so-called Office 39, generate about $2 billion annually. Because of North Korea's economic dependence on Chinese business, we believe that China can effectively pressure the Kim regime to negotiate a halt to its nuclear program. However, until now, the Chinese government has not felt compelled to push North Korea by using the full extent of its legal power to track down banks which allow the Kim regime to dodge sanctions. We believe that China would cooperate with our desire to negotiate with North Korea if the US increases its campaign of targeted secondary sanctions on Chinese banks and corporations which keep the Kim regime afloat. After all, economic instability is the last thing that China wants in North Korea. The US Treasury Department should freeze North Korean accounts in Chinese banks and cut off those banks' access to the US market and financial system. There are at least 10 such small banks and shell companies operating in China. Banks, corporations, and individuals that facilitate illegal transactions of North Korean funds should face sanctions, sending a clear message to China that the US will stand up to institutions that cover for North Korean illicit activities. Facing international scrutiny on North Korean banking practices, China will have to take action, such as imposing fines on its own banks for enabling the Kim regime. Furthermore, we call on the government of China to recognize and sanction North Korean businesses and regime officials who engage in illegal profit-making activities. Targeting entities that give economic support to the North Korean regime with secondary sanctions constitutes a winning strategy to persuade the Chinese government that we are very serious about getting it to cooperate on negotiations with North Korea. A similar strategy proved effective in September 2005 when the US Treasury Department froze assets with $24 million in the Chinese bank Banco Delta Asia, which was distributing North Korean counterfeit currency and allowing money laundering for North Korean criminal enterprises. This led other banks, including the Bank of China, to freeze other North Korean accounts. And just last month, following the death of a young US citizen held in North Korea, the US Treasury Department sanctioned the Bank of Dandong in China, which manages $11.6 billion for laundering North Korean money and facilitating transactions for companies involved in North Korea's weapons program. The US simultaneously sanctioned a Chinese shipping company named Dalian Global Unity for shipping coal and steel between China and North Korea. These measures are the right start. If, as time goes on, China does not take sufficient action against North Korea and crack down on illegal shipping, we will incrementally ramp up our sanctions campaign against more Chinese entities that support the Kim regime. With our secondary sanctions, the Chinese government will finally feel pressured to use its leverage on North Korea to bring it to the negotiating table and enforce compliance with the terms of the nuclear freeze. We will offer to unfreeze bank accounts and lift our secondary sanctions, as well as direct sanctions on North Korea, when our conditions are met on the nuclear freeze. The promise of sanctions relief is a major incentive for Kim to accept this deal. It will also be a great incentive to China to see North Korea regain its stability after years of economic isolation. However, if North Korea violates the terms of the deal, the lifted sanctions will snap back to their pre-negotiation levels for a minimum period of 10 years. US secondary sanctions are necessary to convince China that it needs to cooperate in order for North Korea to agree on a nuclear freeze. Our economic measures must be paired with diplomatic offers which we make to China, as my teammate Ali will now explain.
Hello, my name is Ali Alvarez, and I will discuss the regional relations involved in our policy. North Korea's nuclear program is a major threat to the entire world, but specifically our allies in Asia are most threatened. Since the six-party talks were not completely successful, it's time for a change. These changes will consist of China's complete cooperation, a larger role given to South Korea, and a reorganization of negotiations from the prior six-party talk setup, all the while keeping Japan and South Korea under our military protection. Historically, although China has participated in the six-party talks, they have never fully backed whatever economic pressures on North Korea have resulted from them. Their full participation and complete implementation of our policy would be key to the possible success of it. One thing to understand is that the issue of a nuclearized North Korea is urgent and threatening, and prior negotiations have not worked. That is why we would need to make some critical concessions to China for their possible support. China's biggest concern is the collapse of the North Korean regime, which would cause extreme instability in the region. They in no way will risk this, so supporting our negotiations is the best way to achieve a stable North Korea. Some big concessions that we could be willing to make is the removal of THAAD in South Korea. China is gravely concerned about THAAD's installation and has taken serious economic measures in protest of South Korea. THAAD's removal would only come after China's complete implementation of the pressure that we're asking for. Another serious concession that we as a nation should be willing to make would be in the South China Sea. This would be lessening our military presence, which would be limiting the freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. However, there are also possible moves we can take to move them toward cooperation to our policy. This could potentially include stepping up these freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, and possibly including our allies like Japan. Another option would be to employ THAAD in Japan. This would greatly threaten China, but militarily bolster Japan and secure our protection of them. Our plan is the most feasible and has the best possible outcome. This is because both China and North Korea would benefit from this deal. However, it's important to remember that the concessions to China would only be given after they pressure North Korea economically and a nuclear freeze is reached. South Korea, another aspect of our negotiations would give the best chance to success is giving a larger role to South Korea. President Moon of South Korea said earlier this year, during the periods when South Korea played a more active role, the inter-Korean relationship was more peaceful, and there is less tension between the United States and North Korea. If we give South Korea a leading role in our planned multilateral negotiations, we can improve inter-Korea relations. Bringing peace to the peninsula is vital, and considering South Korea as a major stakeholder in this situation, this would be crucial to our negotiations. President Moon has also promised to help North Korea secure and develop itself after negotiations. Japan would also have equal footing in our six-party talks. That would include the original actors: China, US, North Korea, South Korea, and Russia. They have expressed an openness to the employment of THAAD in Japan and a willingness to back up economic sanctions on North Korea. This would help in convincing China to adopt our policy, since the deployment of THAAD would greatly threaten them. However, we would only take these steps when it would be necessary, and it would be all in the pursuit of a very possible outcome of a nuclear freeze from the North Korean nuclear program. These negotiations will consist of multiple six-party talks like the past. All regional actors will have equal footings in these discussions, while some can act as moderators, such as Russia. However, a new aspect will be direct negotiations between North Korea and the United States. North Korea has expressed this desire, and President Trump has proven willing to do so. So this bilateral negotiation will be new. In support of South Korea's larger role, there should be bilateral negotiations between North Korea and South Korea. This would improve relations and create better conditions on the peninsula. By using both bilateral and multilateral discussions, with every country's full participation, we could successfully achieve a freeze to North Korea's nuclear program. Some will argue that negotiations didn't work in the past, and they won't work now. However, China's possible support in our policy could be game-changing, which was glaringly lacking in prior talks. This, in addition to a variety of negotiations and South Korea's leading role, can quite possibly lead to all the countries' implementation of our policy, which would most definitely freeze the North Korean nuclear program. I will now pass the stage to our team leader, Ross.
Once again, our proposal of negotiations from strength would begin with negotiations for a Chinese program of heavy economic pressure on North Korea in return for major American concessions to China, in the event that China pushed North Korea towards a nuclear freeze deal. If negotiations with China stalled, we would take incrementally increasing measures against Chinese banks working with North Korea, in order to spur Chinese action and increase pressure on North Korea ourselves. Once negotiations for Chinese cooperation were successfully completed, we would expect Chinese pressure on the North Korean economy to force North Korea to engage in negotiations on a nuclear freeze. While we should not underestimate the difficulty of getting North Korea to abandon the development of a nuclear program that it sees as fundamental to its security, we believe that a combination of heavy American and Chinese pressure and concessions to assure the regime of its own security, while allowing them to hold on to their existing nuclear weapons, would compel North Korea to agree to a nuclear freeze. And regular inspections with snapback sanctions from both the US and China in the event of any cheating would compel the North Koreans to stick to the agreement. With North Korea on the verge of developing the capability to launch nuclear missiles at Los Angeles, it is high time to accept the costs of our proposed concessions in order to deal with the North Korean nuclear threat. Our proposal for North Korea offers a unique combination: a realistic chance of lasting, major tangible gains in the near future, specifically a nuclear freeze bolstered by snapback sanctions from the US and China, and low risk. We would be removing rather than increasing potential flashpoints. Furthermore, this would be achieved through buy-in from all major regional actors. Though some might try to convince you otherwise, engaging in negotiations which acknowledge the realities of North Korea's nuclear program and security position would hardly risk significant lasting harm to regional security or our position as a world leader. Before we rashly pursue a hawkish policy that substantially heightens the risk of the worst war of our lifetimes, or resign ourselves to letting a survive-at-all-costs North Korean regime proceed with a long-range nuclear weapons program that will soon be nearly irreversible, why not try the negotiations from strength policy that we have outlined? To fail to do so would be to throw away our best shot at dealing with the North Korean nuclear crisis at the time we most need it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Team A. I will now turn to our experts first. Erin, would you like to get started?
Sure. So there's one word that I didn't hear much of in the presentation I wanted to hear a little bit more about now, and that word is enforcement. The only thing more magical than ballistic missile defense is the IAEA. And so we have a freeze. And the North Koreans go, you're right, we're good, we're done, have at it. I'm not so old, but I'm old enough to have heard that before. How do we know that they're actually going to stop, quote, all nuclear activities? What are our mechanisms for not just getting the total sucker payment out of this whole ordeal? We give away the farm in East Asia, and 10 years from now, North Koreans are like, remember how we lied before? We totally just did it to you again.
Yeah. Well, as you know, as we can look back at history and like, of course, say that North Korea has, you know, violated these things before. I believe that with this current deal of reinforced snapback sanctions from both China and the United States, that it provides a stronger incentive for North Korea not to break the deal. But of course, they very well could. And in the case that would happen, regardless of the fact that we made the concession of taking THAAD out of South Korea, we're still in looking towards the future, we're still in a great position in terms of legitimacy in the region. Because then it's not that the United States broke a deal or the United States that is being imperial, it's that North Korea was given a chance to keep their nuclear arsenal, and they broke the deal as well.
Well, let's push on that just a little bit, because I think I could certainly imagine regional allies and folks elsewhere finding us a little credulous that we were willing to make, as you guys have described, significant concessions without, it seems, a really robust enforcement plan, right? So the IAEA has funding issues. It's the source of flashpoints and crises. You know, what happens when the North Koreans don't let inspectors in? I've seen that movie before too, right? It didn't have a super great ending. So are there investments that would need to be made in intelligence or in regional partners to bolster our monitoring and enforcement of this agreement? Or are we really left kind of to the North Koreans, to my mind, seem like they're willing to live with the current sanctions, right? I mean, they've done more tests this year in the last 6 months than they've done in the last 6 years. So I don't know that snapback sanctions are really going to feel that, jarring to them? Are there other things that we might be able to do to improve our ability to check up on them?
If I may.
Yeah.
Yeah. So our deal depends really on China's cooperation in enforcing compliance with this deal. And we're confident that our plan is robust enough to ensure Chinese cooperation in enforcing that compliance. This is because we think it's in China's serious interest to do so, seeing as the alternative might be a military option, which China definitely doesn't want, which could lead to the collapse of North Korea and all sorts of flood of refugees into China, as well as a vacuum of power in a state that has nuclear weapons. So that's the main reason why China will definitely enforce its cooperation. Well, China's cooperation will definitely enforce the terms of this deal. China's the only power that has real, China's the only nation that has real power to do so on account of the connection between the two countries. And one of the reasons why the US sanctions have not succeeded in the past in deterring North Korea, and for example, why the UN sanctions from the Security Council have failed, is because due to China's place on it as a permanent member in that Security Council, that they have enforced only the bare minimum of requirements and have often allowed loopholes to proceed in those deals. And so by getting China to fully enforce what we see as being in our best interest, as well as in their interest, we can close to guarantee that the North Korean situation will be under control.
I'm gonna let my colleagues talk more about China here in a second. One thing we didn't talk a ton about also was Japan. I'm kind of wondering how they're gonna feel about this arrangement. I think you guys, there's a persuasive case to make with regard to South Korea and Moon at the moment. They've certainly pursued a sunshine policy previously, and there are appetites in various parts of the South Korean domestic public for a more accommodationist policy with regard to the North. There are not as many of those pockets in Japan, and certainly not in the current leadership with Prime Minister Abe. Are we concerned about risks that Japan might see us as being not just too accommodating with North Korea, but also with China, and that might incentivize them to change their defensive posture in the region as well?
If I could answer
Sure.
that one. That's a very real concern that we have when we're making up this policy. But Japan has countless times demonstrated their support for U.S. Whatever policy we decide to take with North Korea. The North Korean nuclear threat is a great threat to them, both through the nuclear program and provincially. So this policy that we came up with, although does raise some concern for the concessions that we're giving to China for Japan, I think the greater risk is the nuclear threat that North Korea poses, and I think that Japan would, concerning the openness that they've expressed in the past and their willingness to work through the six-party talks, would definitely back this policy.
Well, six-party talks have historically focused on denuclearization, though, so I think it's a very different posture for Japan to accept a nuclear Korea, even with a freeze. We've not even talked about the missile program, which, of course, provides a significant threat to Japan as well. But I think that's going to be a lot for them to handle, and it'll be interesting to watch them. Go on. Josh, do you want to go next?
Yeah, just to follow that, a point of clarification. Does the freeze include R&D on the ballistic missile side? So all activities, warheads, missiles, and nuclear must stop. North Korea can't pop off any more missiles at all.
No.
Okay, so it has to stop. My question has to do with cyber attacks. There's a lot of enthusiasm for covert cyber attacks, I think from both teams this morning. Why are you so enthusiastic? And the reason I'm asking the question is that the record of offensive cyber operations to date is mixed at best. Right? The Stuxnet attack actually didn't affect the Natanz plant very much at all. The rate of uranium enrichment increased during the Stuxnet attack window. Right? So that wasn't really a happy outcome. There's not a lot of evidence that I've seen in the public literature that left-of-launch attacks on North Korea had any measurable effect. In fact, they keep testing and building at sort of breakneck speed. So I'm not sure these things are effective, and I'm not sure that they can remain covert. Indeed, anytime something happens, it takes about 5 minutes for it to appear in the New York Times. So why would North Korea or the American public or anybody watching not immediately say, oh my God, the lights are going out in Pyongyang, missiles aren't firing properly, wouldn't they simply assume that this was a US-led attack?
That's a very realistic point, and something that I thought a lot about when I was creating a strategy for cyber attacks. And to your first point about the accuracy or the effectiveness of them, that's probably why I didn't include, for example, another proposed plan that I had read about, which was shutting down the entire nuclear power grid, as that could be seen as a preventive attack. And the reason that I chose specifically these left of launch attacks, yes, they may not always work, but it doesn't hurt to use them. Whereas the other preventive measures, such as these airstrikes or these offshore attacks, they might bring a lot of costs to us. And the U.S. has been the primary, as we can see, undertaker of all these strategies against North Korea, and our allies love to free ride. So the way that
We love them to free ride too. It's important to remember that.
Yeah, of course. But I would say that, yes, we can't always remain covert. When this last left of launch attack happened, it was obviously us. We didn't confirm it. And that's the way it's going to be. But if we can remain, it's deniable. And it would only be leading up to negotiations. So hopefully, through the negotiations, of course, we're looking at this through an optimistic lens, we would be able to have them agree to a freeze, and in that case, we wouldn't really need to use these cyber attacks. However, I do think that it would be a good option to continue to invest in them, because not only would they be beneficial in this situation, but in the situation that my other peers will be talking about later in the afternoon, they could even help combat ISIS. So I don't think that there's a reason not to use them, and I think that we just have to be more willing to put more of our efforts into furthering the programs and understanding why the failed attacks were failed.
Okay, I'll give you one reason, just real quick, one reason that you might not want to use them is that they might be escalatory. And we talked about this a bit earlier, right? If North Korea's conventional military in some ways is quite pathetic, and the regime believes that nuclear weapons are the ultimate guarantor of its security, your signal to them is, we can undermine your regime's security by using a computer, right? Why wouldn't they preempt that in a crisis, in a real no-kidding military crisis? Why wouldn't they worry that the U.S. could shut down the nuclear and launch before we send out a cyber attack?
They definitely could, but they also have their own cyber capabilities, as we saw with their hack on Sony a couple years ago, and we can see that that's realistic. I won't, it's a good question. I think that in hopes of these negotiations going well, that would no longer be on the table. If they don't go well, which they very well couldn't if China doesn't cooperate, cyber attacks may be the only option that we have other than strategic patience, and I think it's a risk that we should be willing to take, regardless of their retaliation.
Let's move on to Chris.
Yeah, so I appreciate this brief. I see where you're going with it, and I think you've done a fine job of backing up your argument. I have some questions with regard to some of the assumptions, the basic assumptions. You talked about how this approach will lead to buy-in of the regional actors, but as I listen to the presentation, look at the details, listen to my colleagues here, I can't help but think that Japan, when you're assuming that this ballistic missile program will at least freeze where it's at, and we know they have a capacity to hit Japan, South Korea, Alaska, possibly the western coastline of the United States, and a nuclear program we already know that they have capacity. I mean, this is a significant threat it's an existential threat to Japan. Do you believe that Japan will start a nuclear program of their own? That's number one. Do you believe they will? And what do you assess the probability, and what would be the impact on the region? Go ahead.
I've read reports saying that Japan is obviously, like, this very much is an existential threat, and they've suggested increasing these forces, like ground troops, or like they don't actually have them, but some sort of like military forces, and considering a nuclear program. So I think the possibility of that happening is very real unless we take action now. And I think Japan realizes that the regional implications would be very big, including like China would very much it would be a very, very risky move for Japan to begin a nuclear program. And I feel like if we begin this policy as soon as possible, that and communicate to Japan all the risks involved, and that this is the best possible way to freeze a nuclear threat, I think that that's not as likely for Japan to begin like a nuclear
Except for even in your ideal case. Let's say we imagine that you're utterly successful. Even in that condition, you still have North Korea with the capacity to strike Japan, and they now say, well, how can we then work deterrence? To me, if we end up going in this direction, they're going to start a nuclear program. And keep in mind that the president has not followed up in many months, but he initially said, well, that's not a bad idea. So he hasn't been necessarily pursuing that, but he has once said that. And Japan feels a sense of insecurity and sees that there were no real sanctions on North Korea to join the club, and they may decide that that's in their interest. We have to start thinking about what that impact is for the regional. Likewise, for South Korea, even in your best case scenario, again, North Korea still has these capabilities, and now you're talking about even in your best case scenario withdrawing THAAD, and then you start to say, well, then what does deterrence look like for South Korea? I think this is problematical in terms of getting regional buy-in. Let me also pursue from a U.S. domestic politics perspective. This is very challenging to find, because remember, President Obama, when he briefed incoming President Trump, said this is going to be your number one challenge. So even among the progressive left, there's a belief that this is a very real challenge. And then, of course, you have the right that sees this, and we've seen all kind of conversation. So from a domestic politics perspective, there's a perception that this is a nightmare scenario, and then we're saying, but fear not, because we actually have a freeze coming. I think that poses significant domestic challenges. Let me add one last thing. When it comes to freedom of navigation, I think you'd have a hard time finding any domestic support, particularly among policy experts, of reducing freedom of navigation. I see where you're going. You're trying to have a carrot and stick approach to China. I encourage that. I think it doesn't have to be binary. I think we can take a carrot and stick approach. But rather than yielding on freedom of navigation, I would recommend you take a step back and say, what is this all about for China? Is it about freedom of navigation? It's really not. It's about the economic exclusion zone that comes with, these islands, if you will, these man-made, they're shored up islands, the Spratlys, Scarborough Shoal, and the economic exclusion zone of 200 miles that goes with it as it relates to fish and natural gas. So maybe a better approach to address their insecurity and their concerns there, instead of yielding freedom of navigation, would say, look, we're willing to be in conversations with our ally Philippines. Maybe we can find some kind of accommodation here to all of this. I think that's possible, and maybe even more enticing to them to get involved in this conversation. So that's really my critique to you, is that it's you have an internal consistency in your logic, which is a really good thing. But I think that at the level of assumptions, you would have some major challenges in terms of the regional actors and from domestic politics.
Let me turn to Gordon.
My question was, I think you guys are, your plan is, let's use sanctions as, to use Chris's nomenclature, sort of a stick against Chinese banks to force China to do what we want, basically, in North Korea. If the Chinese decide not to respond to this incentive structure that we're setting up by doing what we want them to do, what do you think their retaliatory measures could be if we're ramping up sanctions against major Chinese financial institutions, and what downside does that potentially entail for the United States and international financial institutions and actors? And I guess the second question is, in terms of the carrot that you're trying to provide for China on the South China Sea concessions, Which of our allies do you think will be rankled by those, and sort of who are you throwing under the bus in order to get China to advance your policy?
Maybe start with David or Ross.
Yeah, what's the first question again?
I can respond to the first part if you'd like, about what if China doesn't take the bait on sanctions? What if they don't want to play ball? I think that is a possibility out there. I also think it's unlikely given the interconnectedness between the U.S. and Chinese economy. We depend on each other for trade, and China definitely doesn't want to risk that relationship at the cost of more U.S. hostility towards North Korea in the event that they don't halt their weapons program. Because of the relationship between China and the U.S., I don't think that it's likely that China would risk all the costs associated with that.
I think especially at a time when the Chinese economy is potentially weakening and they have a debt crisis looming, obviously they could take measures against U.S. trade flows with China, but we don't think it's likely.
To add one thing to that, also, even though we don't believe it's necessarily likely, if they were to refuse cooperation, they didn't want to, then regardless, this is the last chance for diplomatic measures, right? So if of course if China doesn't, if this is all very contingent on China, but if China doesn't want to cooperate, then the worst case scenario is we go to a Team B perspective, which is that we need to include more military force and we need to become more hawkish. But at this point in time, we believe there's a strong chance of China cooperating, and if they don't, then the only thing we really concede, we don't concede much, and we also do seem more legitimate in the sense of we tried to do this and it didn't work, so now we have these reasons for being hawkish.
Would Team B like to ask one question of Team A before we break for lunch?